Shepard. Thank you, sir. You may begin.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to part 2 of our widely attended gathering, Massive Open Online course. I'm Patrick Shepard and I'm here again with Cheryl Kane-Piasecki.
Howdy.
We're really pleased to be back with you for part 2 of the widely attended gathering, Massive Open Online course. We hope you had an opportunity to watch part 1. If you missed it, you can view it on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/OGE Institute. It will be there probably in perpetuity.
Yes.
So if you missed it, don't worry about it. It's available. But today we're going to go over the exercise and talk about some of the questions you guys have sent us between the 2 sessions. And hopefully you've had an opportunity to look at the exercise and kind of think it through and maybe make some notes on your widely attended gathering analysis worksheet. If you haven't, that's okay. We're going to talk through it. And hopefully this will give you an opportunity to practice and kind of make sure that you understand the framework of the rule and have some practice applying it.
And we are going to have, we're going to allow for Q&A throughout the session today. We have some discrete sort of like sections to today's presentation. As Patrick said, we're going to start with some of the questions that we actually got after the broadcast on Tuesday. We're going to begin with those, and then we'll probably open it up to see if anybody has any questions about the questions. Then we're going to talk briefly about the exercise that we gave you. We're going to start with that 201B analysis, which is the new provision. The impartiality integrity provision is the shorthand that our integrity provision. That's in 201B, which the employee ostensibly undertakes or should be encouraged to undertake. So we'll do that first with respect to the exercise, and then we will actually sort of like march through that widely attended gathering worksheet, page by page, so that you can see how to utilize that worksheet, and we'll be having a very open discussion about that. So at the end of each of those sort of discrete pieces, we'll be opening up the phone lines for folks if you have questions about anything that we've discussed or anything that's on your mind.
Absolutely. And we're really grateful for the folks who sent us questions between the 2 sessions. It's really helpful to see what you're still interested in learning more about, or what wasn't clear from the first session, and have the opportunity to sort of address again or address for the first time some of those issues. So for those who submitted questions, thank you very much.
Yes, indeed. So if we could pull up the slide deck, we have a slide deck that we sent you, which includes the questions that we received yesterday. So the first question we got, I've summarized sort of like what the bottom line was to the question, and I'm gonna embellish, or I'm gonna share with you sort of like more of the details of the actual question after we discuss sort of the bottom line question. The bottom line question was effectively, if an employee accepts gifts under other gift exceptions besides the 2050 de minimis exception, do those dollar values of those gifts have to be counted toward or aggregated for purposes of the $50 per year per source cap into a 4A?
Right.
And the answer to that is no.
Which is very good for birthdays and weddings, any holidays you celebrate that provide gift-giving occasions.
Right. So, I mean, the simple answer is that each of the exceptions is a discrete exception. And the 2050 exception is its own exception. So you only have to aggregate dollar values if that's the exception you're availing yourself of.
Right.
So if you're using other exceptions to accept gifts, those do not have to be counted toward that $50 per year per source cap. Now, the actual question that I got gave me a for instance, and the question was, so let's say you attend, and this isn't verbatim, but the essence of the question was, so let's say that the employee attends like a widely attended gathering, the dollar value of the widely attended gathering is $35 from XYZ company. And then, a couple of months later, XYZ company wants to take the employee out for lunch, and the lunch is like a $19 lunch. Would you have to aggregate the value of the widely attended gathering free attendance with the $19 lunch for purposes of the $50 cap?
Right.
And the answer to that is no, because if you accepted some of it under the widely attended gatherings exception, that would not count towards the 2050 exception if that's what you were using to accept the $19 lunch.
Right.
Now, what I do want to raise about the way the original question came in is an issue of frequency.
Right.
And so, Patrick, I think this is one of the things that we've been increasingly trying to get at with respect to not treating the exceptions as sort of like rights for the employee to be able to take whatever is available, provided there's an exception that would allow for it. That we still have issues of frequency of gift giving and whether or not that's any kind of indicia of undue influence or access.
Right.
So, I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are on it, but my response to the person who sent the question in was precisely that frequency issues are something that you should be considering if you have an employee who's getting repetitive gifts from the same source.
And if we think about sort of the broader principles that underlie the gifts from outside sources regulation, what we're talking about here is, one, not accepting prohibited gratuities, but also not using public office for private gain or using the authority of your office to sort of benefit yourself materially. So in that regard, I think it's helpful to think of the exceptions not as rights, but to think of them as avenues that allow people to accept gifts when the gifts don't pose a problem under the provisions, the integrity and partiality provisions, and where there's maybe a good reason to accept a gift. So I think one of the things we were trying to do with the revision to Subpart B is change the default. So the first thing we should be asking is, is this appropriate? Does it, would it hinder my integrity or impartiality in my official work? Would it look like I'm using my public office for private gain? And where you can answer those questions in the negative, to provide some limited avenues to accept things, rather than there's an exception, so therefore it's mine. That's not really the viewpoint that we want to start from.
Well, and I think that, and I've said this many times before in various gift classes that we've conducted, an exception is just that. It's an exception, which means that it should be for exceptional circumstances. So I think we sometimes sort of gloss over what the overarching prohibition is. The overarching prohibition is no gifts from prohibited sources and no gifts given because of your official position.
Right.
And that's the predicate. That's what we start with. And then we look at the totality of the circumstances, and then we say, is this a circumstance where one of the exceptions can appropriately be used to accept what would otherwise be a prohibited gift? Because let's not lose sight of that. These are otherwise prohibited gifts.
Right. And I think that's most true, or especially true, when we're talking about widely attended gatherings.
Yes.
Because an explicit element here is that it's in the agency's interest, which means in the government's interest, for the employee to attend the event. So there's sort of an even higher sensitivity about accepting these kinds of gifts, and there needs to be a determination made that it's in the interest of the government and in the interest of the agency specifically. And I think that's something to keep in mind, because oftentimes we're approached by an employee. They say, I've been invited to this thing, I want to go to this thing, tell me how I can get there. And the answer should begin from the question, is it really in the agency's interest? And I think we talked yesterday about what you do here at OGE, which is, you find out from the person's supervisor or the person who directs that person's work, whether, what is the business need here? And that's really the role of the widely attended gathering exception, is to fill in those gaps, to allow agencies to allow employees to attend events that they don't have other authorities to allow them to attend those events using.
So thank you for this question. So let's move on to the second question. The second question we got was, does the phrase present information refer just to giving a speech? Does it also refer to participating on a panel? Does it include manning a booth at an expo to answer questions, etc.? And this was with direct reference, obviously, to the what used to be the G1 provision, which is the free attendance on the day that the employee is assigned to present information on behalf of the agency.
Now it's exclusion 8.
Yeah, now it's exclusion. It's 203B8, I think, is the exclusion. I sent the person who sent this question in, I sent them a reference to a legal advisory that OG issued back in 2012. We've given you just a little snapshot of it here. This legal advisory goes into quite a bit of discussion about what we mean by when someone is, speaking or otherwise assigned to present information on behalf of the agency. And I think if you're not familiar with this legal advisory, I would encourage you to become familiar with it. I wanted to read just sort of in relevant part, one of the clarifying things that OGE included in this advisory. And for those of you who, when you go to reference it, it's on page 2, in the third paragraph. It says, under section G1, which would now be 203 B8, the employee may accept an unsolicited gift of free attendance only so long as the event's host has agreed in advance that the employee will make informal remarks on behalf of the agency to those attendees. An employee's presentation, in quotes, at an event need not come from a dais or from the stage, but the employee must nonetheless communicate the agency's message in a deliberate, substantive presentation. For example, when an employee is serving as an agency liaison to a particular outside organization, participation at periodic meetings or ongoing working groups would qualify as presenting information on behalf of the agency because the employee has been assigned to communicate a specific agency message. So I think the takeaways from this, and which can be applied to the exclusion, are in effect, it doesn't have to be a speech.
Right.
It doesn't have to be a formal delivery of a presentation as would occur if you were on a panel or if you were at sitting at or standing behind a podium. It can be less formal than that. I think one of the important factors is that we anticipate that the employee should know in advance that they are being asked to present information on behalf of the agency.
Right. And the agency should be clear that that is the purpose of the employee's attendance.
Yes.
That there is a sort of a specific message or a specific need that the agency is fulfilling by sending the employee to share information, and that there will be a real opportunity to do so. And I guess you could contrast this to the sort of situation where someone's in attendance at a presentation being delivered by someone else and they happen to ask a question.
Right.
Right. That simply the fact that they happen to speak during the course of a presentation isn't the same thing as being sent to present particular information on behalf of the agency.
Right. And I think that when you have like informal events where the employee may very well be mingling, and I don't want to say that they're exclusively social, but, an event where the employee is going to be mingling among other people. And while it's understood that as part of the mingling and the conversations that they're having, they will be talking about agency business and maybe conveying information about the agency. That is not the type of thing that OGE does see it as being something more structured, where the intent of the agency of sending the person is for them to present information. And while it doesn't have to formally be a speech, it should be understood that their reason for them being there is to present information on behalf of the agency.
Right. And that we anticipate that there will be an opportunity to do so.
Yes.
Right. That's so you're listed on the schedule, or there's going to be a round table or whatever.
Yeah, and it can be a roundtable discussion.
Right.
It could be something that's not really formal where you just are giving an address. But likewise, it can't be something that's incidental or,
right,
casual that way. Okay.
That's a good question.
Question number 3 was this. What does this mean? For an employee who is subject to a leave system, attendance at the event will be on the employee's own time, or if authorized by the employee's agency on excused absence pursuant to applicable guidelines for granting such absence, or otherwise without charge to the employee's leave account. And this is right from the regulation at 204 G1. This is reaching to what Patrick and I were discussing yesterday as the preamble to the discussion about the widely attended gathering exception when we were talking about the purpose of it. The bottom line is that OGE was trying to create sort of like what we saw was a sort of like a hole among authorities in terms of agencies having the ability to send their folks to events and be able to accept free attendance at those events where the agency clearly wanted the employee to attend. For those people who don't have statutory gift acceptance authority, OGE created an employee gift acceptance authority that allows the employee to accept free attendance at events where the agency has established that there's an agency interest in their attendance. The only way that free attendance can be a gift to the employee and not to the agency is if the employee is not there on the clock. So the gift can only be to the employee if the employee is there, not in an official, duty performance, official duty activity. So this is what 204G1 is stipulating, is that in order to use the widely attended gathering exception, because it has to be clear that it is a gift to the employee and not to the agency, because OGE has no authority to create an agency gift acceptance authority, the employee has to be there other than on official duty time. So they can either take leave, or you can give them an excused absence or grant administrative leave. But one way or the other, the employee's attendance has to be other than during official duty time.
Right. I think that makes sense. And I think this is all the more reason to think of WAG as an authority that you look to after you've exhausted the other possibilities, up to including exclusion 8. I know people sort of struggle with the interrelation between what used to be G1 exclusion 8 and widely attended gatherings. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that if you've assigned someone to go deliver a speech or otherwise present information, they may do that on official duty time, and there's no gift to the agency and there's no gift to the employee. If they're not doing that at similar events, well, you either have to use agency gift acceptance authority, one of the other authorities like 31 USC 1353, or if you do a WAG analysis, that person has to be in some kind of leave status because they're accepting that gift personally. So that's, I think, another reason to look elsewhere before coming back to WAG and saying, sort of this is the way we get the person to the event where the agency has an interest in them attending.
Okay, so those are the questions that we got yesterday. We received another question late yesterday afternoon, but we're gonna discuss that one more in the context of the actual analysis that we're gonna do on the WAG. So if we could open up the phone lines for any questions that anyone has about anything we've spoken about so far.
Thank you. If you would like to ask a question over the phone, unmute your phone, press star followed by the number 1, and when prompted, record your name clearly so I may introduce you. To withdraw your question, press star 2. Again, to ask a question, star 1. It'll take a few moments for questions to come in. Please stand by.
Okay. Once we've had an opportunity to answer any questions that have been asked in this phase, we're going to move on to our exercise, and Patrick has posted it up there for you. So the next thing we're going to do is briefly walk through that and talk about what the facts are that we have, and then we're going to move on to our 201B analysis, the impartiality integrity analysis. But if folks have questions, we want to answer those before we move on.
And I show no questions at this time, but again, as a reminder, star 1 to ask a question.
Okay, very good. Okay, so we're going to move on then to the exercise, and hopefully everybody's had a chance to take a look at this. So let's just walk through literally the fact pattern that we have here. Jane Q. Doe, who is the Vice President for Governmental Affairs at Advocacy Now, has sent an email to our employee, Jamie Smith, and inviting him or her to a dinner on July 18th. And it appears that it says, in conjunction with the National Policy Summit being held here in Washington, D.C. from July 17th through the 20th, Advocacy Now is sponsoring a dinner on July 18th at 7 p.m. at Chic Haute Cuisine for a small group of thought leaders, policymakers, and members of industry to discuss matters of mutual concern being addressed at the summit. We hope you and your colleagues are able to join us for the evening. Dress as business casual, cocktails will be served at 6:30, followed by dinner and brief remarks from 3 leaders of industry. Please RSVP. We look forward to seeing you July 18th. So kind of in a nutshell here, it looks like we have an advocacy organization. Their governmental affairs folks are inviting our employee to a dinner. All that we know about the dinner is that it's evidently, at least topic-wise, subject matter-wise, it seems to be touching on whatever topics are being covered at this National Policy Summit. It says it's going to be a small group. We don't know how large. We don't know how large or small. Vaguely refers to thought leaders, policymakers, and members of industry to discuss matters of mutual concern. So we don't know necessarily what matters of mutual concern, and we don't necessarily know who these folks are. There's going to be a cocktail reception, evidently at 6:30, followed by dinner. It looks like it's a kind of swanky
Yeah, it
location.
Sounds nice.
Yeah. And then evidently there are also going to be remarks from 3 leaders of industry. And we also don't know, these are anonymous leaders of industry. So we clearly have some holes in our fact pattern here. But we have at least a broad sensibility, I think, about what's going on here.
And I think, it's not really that unusual when you receive these invitations to have less than a complete set of facts.
Yes.
I find that to be pretty typical of these kinds of invitations. It's like, hope you can join us. Here's the time and day. And having organized events, part of that may be that they haven't decided these things yet either. But yeah, so I think it's not uncommon that we have to find out more information or think a little more deeply than just what's on the face of an invitation.
Exactly. So if we can go back to the deck right now, the first thing we want to do with this particular fact pattern is I think we want to take a moment to talk about the impartiality integrity tests. This is the thing that we would ideally like the employee to consider when the employee receives this invitation. So we would want Jamie actually to be kind of asking him or herself these questions or looking at these things before they even come to us. We certainly are going to have to entertain these same questions when it comes to making a determination of agency interest and then also doing that balancing test between agency interest and any appearance concerns. But if you can get the employee to be thinking about these things, in order to answer these questions, they're going to have to be in possession of more information, which means it makes it more likely that when they come back to you, they can have more information to provide you and you aren't going to have to do that legwork. So let's start with the first question, Patrick. The value, is the gift expensive or relatively cheap?
Well, this seems like a pretty nice dinner. So it sounds like we're going to have a cocktail reception. In DC, it's a cocktail go for about $8-10 nowadays. And then followed by a dinner at what sounds like a pretty fancy restaurant. So this, I think you could easily see this go into the kind of hundreds of dollars range in terms of value. So I think for sitting around listening to people talk, the things being provided seem pretty nice. This isn't a brown bag lunch where you get a stale sandwich and a bag of chips.
Yes.
Right. It seems a little better than that.
And so, I mean, I think and this is one of those areas where if all that you've gotten from the employee is this invitation, I do think that it's entirely, acceptable for you to go back to the employee and say, I need more information about like the value of this dinner. And if they're unwilling or unable to do it, then you certainly can contact the whoever's in charge of this event to ascertain what the actual dollar value of the event is. Because I do think it's important to have some sensibility about the per head cost of these, even if we don't need it technically for purposes of, it's a non-sponsor invitation, and so we have to know exactly the dollar value,
or for reporting requirements.
I think it's always useful to have an idea of exactly how
how valuable this experience is going to be. Because I think, from what we have here, it doesn't seem like we're going to graze the $390 platform unless, something's a little bit silly. But all the same, I think, in this prudential step, which applies for all of the gifts, right?
Yes.
This isn't just for WAG. This is for all of the gift exceptions. It's important to think about because it factors into our prudential decision-making. Yeah, so I think, this sounds like a pretty nice dinner.
Yes, I think so too. Okay, so then the question becomes the timing. Is the gift given at a time when the donor is seeking or has business before the agency?
I have no idea.
Exactly.
We'd have to find out. To find out who Advocacy Now is, find out if they have business before the agency, and the employee might be able to assist us in that area.
And I think it'd be interesting to know too exactly what Advocacy Now's role is, sort of vis-a-vis some of the other people who are going to be in attendance at this event, and what their sort of policy interests are in the National Policy Summit, because it seems that the subject matter of this dinner is supposedly linked or intimately related to whatever the policy discussions that are being held at this National Policy Summit.
And I think we have to be really careful here. We see this a lot where you have an advocacy group or a trade organization that is really sort of an organizer for a class of industry participants. And when you look at really the totality of the circumstances, this is an event that's being underwritten or being financed by industry participants as a way to convey their views to important officials and other members of the industry. So kind of looking behind that first layer from a prudential perspective can be very important, because you say, well, what is advocacy now? It's like, oh, it turns out that it's a nonprofit organization that's funded by one or two companies. And what do? Well, they hold dinners and parties so that those one or two companies can make their case to whoever.
Right.
And that's important information to have, because I think part of the goal with the impartiality and integrity determination is to give us a framework for thinking about situations that look like rule beating, right? Where someone sort of set up an organization as their front so that it, under the law, looks less troubling. And that's not really the purpose, right? We're trying to make a prudential determination. So we should find out who's behind advocacy now. Exactly.
And that gets into this identity. Is the donor someone who has interests affected by the employee's official duties? Because particularly when you're dealing with lobbying types of organizations, they themselves may not be the entity with the policy interest or the procurement interest, or they're representing and working on behalf of other entities that have that interest. And so in this particular case, you would want the employee to be able to sort of identify, why is it that they were being invited? Like what is the interest that not just the donor, but anybody that the donor is working on behalf of might have in having our employee attend their event.
Right.
And then similarly, access. Is the gift going to provide the donor with significantly disproportionate access to the employee and the agency? What are the things in this invitation, Patrick, that give you pause with respect to this last question?
I think some of the two factors in here that really stood out to me is, one, this is a small group, right? This isn't a huge auditorium full of people. So there's a suggestion that this invitation is targeted specifically to those people who are viewed as sort of high value recipients of information. And there's also these unnamed 3 business leaders or industry leaders who are going to address those folks. If all 3 of those folks worked for the same company, for example, and that company had business before the agency, that would raise some significant concerns for me because of this access issue. That this is really just a sort of financed opportunity to put some interested government officials in a room and make sure that they understand our argument and enjoy our champagne.
Yeah, those are the things that sort of jumped out at me too, was that one, that it's a small dinner, and we don't know what they mean by small. So that is clearly something that once we get into our widely attended gathering analysis itself, we're going to have to find out. But that just sort of like, I think it's a matter of not only you as the ethics official getting into the habit of like having certain things ring bells for you or raise red flags, but also sort of like training up your employees, particularly those who attend these kind of events, to kind of be doing that piece of it for you as well. And the step 1 impartiality integrity analysis is really a good place to sort of get people in the habit of asking these more prudential questions and like probing a little bit more, and getting beyond the I'm flattered that I've been invited to an event, and more to the I've been invited to an event, but it's incumbent upon me to know, sort of like have a better sensibility about the motivation for inviting me, who's going to be there, and making them own a little bit of that,
right,
of that analysis piece, and of that sort of understanding the concerns, the appearance concerns that are attendant to that. Now we're going to get into this more, and we're going to have an opportunity to talk about this more once we get into your part of the analysis, which is the determination of agency interest and the balancing act between agency interest and appearance concerns. But does anyone have a question at this point about this step 1 sort of employee analysis piece?
I show no questions at this time, but again, as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, press star followed by the number 1, unmute your line, and record your name clearly when prompted.
Okay, well,
Stand by for incoming questions.
okay, great.
There are no questions.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and we're gonna move on to the WAG analysis worksheet, Patrick, if we can pull that up, and we'll just start doing our widely attended gathering analysis on these facts that we have. Now, understanding, yes, of course, that we have limited facts, but I think we can still have a discussion about what we do know, and it's important. It's almost as important to know how much
we don't know.
We don't know, exactly.
Right.
Okay, so beginning at the beginning. We start with our gifts analysis, which is we have to start by figuring out what the heck our employee is being offered so that we know whether or not we're in widely attended gathering, whether we're in some other aspect of the rule, or where we need to locate ourselves.
Right. And this is important because widely attended gatherings are for attendance.
Yes.
So it's a threshold consideration. It allows you to accept attendance. So that's our first question, right?
Yes. Our first question is there a gift of free attendance as that is defined in the reg? And so when you look at the checklist, we're looking at, is there a waiver of all or part of a conference or other fee? This doesn't appear to be like relevant because it doesn't appear that this is a conference that would have a fee, although it's a dinner, which it would be a matter, I think, of does everybody pay for their dinner or is everybody being comped dinner?
Right. But it seems like it's happening near a conference or around a conference or after a conference, but the thing itself doesn't seem like a conference.
No, it doesn't. But if it were, I mean, if this were like some sort of like mini side conference or something and they were waiving the fee, I mean, obviously that would be something that is eligible to be accepted under the definition of free attendance.
Right.
So waivers of conference and other fees is certainly an eligible expense.
Okay.
Provision of any of the following to all attendees as integral part of the event: food and refreshments, entertainment, instruction, and materials. What do we know that they're going to be providing, at least to our employee?
There's certainly going to be food and refreshment.
There's certainly going to be food and refreshment.
They've promised us dinner and drinks.
Yes. I don't know if having 3 leaders of industry speak would be considered entertainment. I don't know. But in any event, so we know at the very least it's food and refreshments. Now, there is a question, though, whether all attendees are being comped, but
that is a question.
Yeah.
Whether this is a for-fee event for everyone except for the government regulators who we invited to attend for free. So that may be a question we want to ask.
Because I think it's worth knowing whether or not everybody's being offered the free attendance, or if there are only some people who are being offered free attendance. And are there? And then the next question becomes: so we know that we at least have some things that are eligible for the free attendance exception under widely attended gatherings.
Right.
It doesn't appear that there are any other gifts being offered. It doesn't look like they're getting lodging or anything else that's associated.
No.
And
no swag bag listed here or travel, any of that kind of thing. Right.
So we don't have to do any other analysis. It doesn't appear under any of the other authorities. But again, it is a reminder that, as Patrick and I talked about before, always, if you have agency gift acceptance authority and it would reach to allowing your employee to attend events like this and receive and be able to take advantage of the free meal, that is something that you could consider is accepting it under agency gift acceptance authority.
Likewise, if this was away from the duty station, we may be able to use 31 USC 1353 to accept these as travel expenses because of food and refreshment. So, there's that to remember also, which I think is another reason to think first about those other authorities, and then when they don't apply, come to WAG. It seems like this is probably what it says. It's downtown. It's so presumably our employee Jamie Smith works here, so it's not away from duty station. But if it were, that's something to consider.
So I think that it's just fair to say this first page is basically just to locate you within a widely attended gathering exception, and I think that what is being offered our employee is clearly falls within the ambit of free attendance under the widely attended gathering exception. So now we have to kind of move on to, all right, well, now that we're in that provision, is this provision gonna hold up, basically?
Right. Really important thing to remember is just because we've crossed the threshold, and this is something that may be accepted under WAG, doesn't mean we should accept it under WAG. We're certainly not done at this juncture. We're sort of just able to get started.
Yes, exactly. So it's not like, we just have to push forward to get to yes at this point. Not at all. We really only started our analysis.
Right.
Okay, so on page 2, this is where we have to look at the type of gathering, and this is where we're going to get into actually what is the more important and relevant question, which is agency interest.
Yes, absolutely.
So the first question is really kind of a mechanical one, if you will. Does this event appear to actually meet the definition of what we have described in a limited way in the regulation as qualifying as a widely attended gathering?
Right, because we've given some guidelines here in the regulation to help agencies understand the kinds of events we have in mind and how those events might be structured. And looking at these indicia is important to see if we're using this in the way that it's intended.
Exactly. So let's just walk down through the litany of things that we say are things that need to be considered to be determinative of whether or not you can answer yes to the question of whether or not it's a widely attended gathering of mutual interest to a number of parties.
Okay.
So the first question is, do they expect a large number of persons to attend?
And this is always the hardest.
Yeah, we don't give as you've seen in the regulation, there is no hard number that OGE gives with respect to, at least when it's the sponsor of the event who's offering the free attendance.
Right. And here they indicate that it's a small gathering.
Yes.
Which also itself isn't dispositive.
Yes.
So I think we're going to have to get a better sense of how large this event is, but maybe also lean a little more on the other elements to kind of help us make a holistic evaluation.
Yeah, and this is something that I've told agencies often in the past, is that the number is relevant, but the number is actually predicated, the appropriateness of the number or the relevance of the size is really going to be more predicated upon establishing the other things, which is to say that it is clearly of the agency's interest, that it's important for the person to be there, that there are sufficient number of other people there with diverse views, that it doesn't look like your employee is being you're giving exclusive access to a limited universe of people. So while I know that there's probably a number, no, I don't even want to say that. I think we don't want to get too hung up on the number.
Right. And I think there are really good reasons that OG is not given a number. And I know it frustrates folks, but we had an opportunity to work with a colleague of ours who's an ethics official at a regulatory agency that regulates an industry with a very small number of industry participants. And at a large dinner table, they could have a representative from every company that they regulate.
Right.
And I don't think OGE wants to be in the position to say that just because that's fewer than 20 or fewer than a dozen people in the sort of an absolute sense, that doesn't represent a large and diverse group for purposes of the industry. So I think this is relative to the size of the group of interested parties as a whole. So if there's broad representation from all corners of an industry, and that happens to be fewer than 100 people or fewer than 50 people, well, that's why we want agencies to have that flexibility, so that they can determine relative to the number of interested parties, is there broad representation?
Right. And that kind of gets to the second criterion here, which is expect persons with a diversity of views or interests will be present, e.g. if the event is open to members from throughout the interested industry or profession, or if those in attendance represent a range of persons interested in a given matter.
Right.
So it's kind of reaching to what you were saying, is that you can have a relatively speaking small group, but it is made up of, a really good representative sample of the universe of viewpoints on a particular matter.
That's right. And I think this is a place where remembering what we're doing here is really important, right? The widely attended gathering exception provides agencies an opportunity to allow their employees to attend events that are in the agency's interest, right? This is a tool for the agencies to use. So that we give you flexibility to use it shouldn't really come as a great surprise.
And so the final piece is, will there be opportunities for the exchange of ideas and views among invited persons? Now, as some of you may know, it was that this language could only be found in that expansive, widely attended gathering legal advisory that OGE issued, but that this language was not actually in the regulation. In the revisions to the widely attended gathering exception, among the other gifts revisions, we actually have included this language in the regulation. So then that is now part of sort of like the regulatory definition of what constitutes a widely attended gathering. So let's talk a little bit, Patrick, for those who are unfamiliar or maybe are not familiar with OGE's legal advisory in particular, what it is that we're trying to get at, or like what's the relevance of this opportunity for the exchange of ideas and views among.
I think this really derives from the overall purpose of the exception,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is to allow for agencies to present and receive information,
Mm-hmm.
right? And if you're going to allow someone to attend an event in their personal capacity because it's in the interest of the agency to receive and exchange information, there has to be an opportunity to receive and exchange information.
Right.
So we treat this, I think, we treat this seriously.
Mm-hmm.
That has to be available,
Mm-hmm.
and the event has to be structured as an exchange of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And where the event isn't so structured, we shouldn't be using the widely attended gathering exception because it undermines the very purpose of the exception.
And I think one of the reasons that we began to emphasize this too was because clearly there are social types of gatherings that qualify as widely attended gatherings, because even though the event itself appears and is in its essence a social type of event, dinners being among them,
right,
there is still an opportunity, notwithstanding that the sort of the feel of the event or the sort of spirit of the event is social in nature. There's still an opportunity for people to actually mingle and have conversations and to engage in information exchange. But because the WAG contemplates social types of events, we were finding increasingly that agencies were allowing their employees to attend events that clearly had as its primary and almost singular purpose an entertainment or social aspect. Things like baseball games and things like theater performances and things where the opportunity to have any conversation with anyone about anything were very mitigated, and we're simply, the opportunities were not there, or people were having to manufacture a kind
right,
of opportunity to sort of transform what was otherwise a purely social event into something that provided for the opportunity for an exchange.
Right,
of views.
exactly. So, sitting in a balcony at an opera performance, just because you might exchange words before and after the performance,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't magically transform the opera into a discursive event.
Right.
Right.
So I think it was it was an attempt to try to eliminate any confusion that folks had about, when and under what circumstances are social types of events sort of legitimate under the guise of the widely attended gathering exception. And so we just wanted to emphasize that the purpose of the exception is for the agency to be able to exchange in idea exchange and information exchange. And so even if an event is social, it still has to have as its primary function
right,
this kind of exchange.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And in that opinion, we don't slam the door on any particular kind of event, but we ask agencies to think about this.
Mm-hmm.
Is the purpose of this thing to create these kinds of opportunities for exchange?
Mm-hmm.
And where there is an opportunity for exchange, it may be appropriate to move on with the WAG analysis.
Mm-hmm. So I think for purposes of this determination, I don't know that we can say yes yet. I mean, I think that because we don't know how many people are going, so we don't know if it really is a large number of persons. Diversity of views, we can't even say with any degree of certainty that that's in fact the case. And opportunities for the exchange of ideas, it appears as though there probably would be between a cocktail reception and a dinner.
Right.
Typically there are opportunities for.
Yeah. So I think on the last point, I think we would say this is the kind of event. It sounds like the kind of event that's structured appropriately,
mm-hmm.
but I'd be concerned about who's going to be there. Right? Are all these people going to be from one or two companies within the industry that we regulate?
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, well, that's probably not going to tick the diversity threshold.
Right.
So we want to think kind of broadly about, is this an opportunity really for one set of interested parties who share the same view to sort of buttonhole a number of government officials and make sure they hear the view?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's not what we're trying to do.
Mm-hmm. So we've got a question mark by the question at 2.1. But let's go on and talk about 2.2 and 2.3, because I think this is kind of where the rubber meets the road for me, is that if you can't establish these things first, then you don't really even need to go into what the nature of the event is. Because, I mean, like in terms of like the specificity about whether or not it meets the definition of widely attended gathering. Because if you can't meet the threshold consideration of that it's in the agency's interest for this person to attend, and then additionally be able to talk, to be able to answer yes to the fact that the agency's interest actually is going to outweigh concern that the acceptance of the gift may or may appear to improperly influence the employee in the performance of his official duties. I mean, these are the most important calculations that you can make, and in many respects, they probably should be made first.
Right. Except in some cases, we need this information in order to do
Right,
that. So there's
right.
sort of a
There's a balancing act here between the two.
Right.
That's true.
But
That's true.
but this is where we exercise our judgment as an agency.
Right. Right. So let's talk a little bit about agency interest as a general proposition. If we look at our invitation, Patrick, we've got an advocacy group. It's a dinner that's going to be in conjunction with a national policy summit. It's not clear to me at all who our employee is who's being invited, but I think that's a material consideration.
Oh, absolutely.
Who is the person who's being invited? Why are they being invited? And I think that we have to ask ourselves, is this the right person to attend this event? Is this the right event for this person to be attending?
Right.
And your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think those are really important considerations. And I think that's something to keep in mind, that a WAG determination, especially when you're talking about the agency's interest, is going to be very tightly tied up with the role the person plays at the agency.
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, we could find that for certain members of our organization, it would be appropriate in the agency's interest for them to attend, and for others, maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
So we'd have to ask, what is this particular employee's, what kind of value is the agency going to gain from their attendance?
Mm-hmm.
And this may be one of a limited number of opportunities to hear from important stakeholders, folks that the agency really wants to hear from.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, well, that I think would agitate for a greater level of agency interest. If this is someone who's just been invited for who knows why, and there's not really, the agency doesn't care if this person receives this information or has a relationship with these industry stakeholders, maybe we said there's not an agency interest here, right? This is just a dinner for someone to go to.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a bit of a balancing act.
And I think the interesting thing too is that if you notice in the invitation, it says, "We hope you and your colleagues are able to join us for the evening." And that was a little ambiguous for me. And so it sort of set off alarms for me. Is Jamie the only person who's been invited to this, or have other of our agency employees also been invited?
Right.
And I think that I know that this happens where you sometimes get multiple employees invited to the same event. And I do think that you have to do this analysis for each and every one of those employees. Making a determination for one that the event meets the widely attended gathering exception, and then just kind of blowing through the rest of the analysis is really not, just because it's a widely attended gathering doesn't mean that each individual who's been invited to this event, that it's equally suitable or it's equally in the agency's interest for each of the people who've been invited to attend the event.
Right.
So again, just cautionary on that one. Just make sure that if you've got multiple people, that you are actually doing individual determinations for each of those folks.
Right. And I think, some of the ways an agency can have an interest in sending someone to an event like this is if we have information we're trying to get out, or information we're trying to receive in a particularized way, that events like this can provide those kinds of opportunities. But then I think it's important for us to consider the steps in 2.3 and make sure that we're engaged in a balancing.
So let's do that. Let's start walking through some of the steps at 2.3, so we can be thinking about like all of these things and how they should factor into our determination of agency interest. The first thing is the importance of the event to the agency, and we've kind of touched on that, I think, a little bit. That's kind of a threshold issue of, is this an event that we think that agency participation is worthwhile? Because if we don't,
Right.
then we probably shouldn't be accepting free attendance at an event that we're not really sure the agency has any compelling interest in attending. The nature and sensitivity of any pending matter affecting the interests of the person who extended the invitation.
Yeah, and I think this is a tricky one.
Yeah.
And it kind of cuts both ways, because sometimes when we're thinking about making a decision as an agency, we want to get input, but we want to make sure we get input in a fair way.
Right.
And that we don't sort of succumb to only listening to those people that offer us steaks and champagne. So it can kind of cut both ways. I think this is a little easier after we've made a decision and we want to explain how that decision was made, or why we've made it, or what the implications are, because there's no longer a pending matter. But when there is a pending matter, sometimes that can both be a reason for the agency to have an interest and also a reason for caution when doing this balancing test.
Yeah, and I think, and again, I don't want to. I want to focus on the particularities of number 2 for a couple of reasons. One, because I don't want you to focus too narrowly on what the number 2 says. The number 2 says nature and sensitivity of any pending matter affecting the interests of the person who extended the invitation. So if we look in our case, the person who extended the invitation, again, is this advocacy group. And we don't quite know who they are and what they do. But let's say, for argument's sake, that they aren't really the interested party here. That the interested party is one of the other people who's going to be attending this event, and they may even be underwriting this employee's attendance at the event.
Right.
And that's something that, to the extent that we can try to ascertain that, and sometimes you just can't know. It's just it's not information that you're going to get ready access to. But it's something that you want to be concerned about, which is not just the nature and sensitivity of any matters that would affect the person who extended the invitation, but the nature and sensitivity of any matters that could affect anybody who's going to be in attendance at this event.
Right. And I think we try and maybe we should have put these closer together. 2 and 5 work together, right? The identity of other participants is important both for the diversity, but also any lack of diversity.
Right.
Right. If we have, this is really a lobbying dinner where 1 or 2 industry players have gotten together to sponsor an event so that they can make sure that the regulators hear exactly what they have to say. Even if it's important for you to understand their view, this may not be the best forum to receive that information.
Exactly. So the nature of the conversation at the event might be great, but the composition of the people who are going to be there is such that you're really allowing a very small select group to have disproportionate access to your person to potentially influence a decision-making point. Number 3 is the significance of the employee's role in any such matter. So this is kind of getting back to what we were talking about before, like who is the person who's being invited, and what is their role in the organization? What sort of duties do they have that are relevant to the topics that are going to be discussed at this event? Are they the appropriate person? If you're going to have agency representation at this event, are they the appropriate person to be sending, or is there someone who would be more appropriate?
Right.
If you're trying to extend sort of an agency presence there, and you want to make sure it's the right agency person who's going there. But likewise, if the employee is really critical and there's a critical decision that's coming down the pike, or the people who are going to be at this event, or at least even some of the people who are going to be at this event are people who this employee is in the throes of making some decisions or working on certain things, which clearly they have a dog in that fight. Again, you may want to consider whether or not you want to expose your employee to that environment under those circumstances, in that given moment.
Right. Yeah. No, so I think this is another one that kind of cuts both ways. We could have a situation where someone's contemplating a regulatory change that would affect industry participants. And this is an opportunity for some limited segment of that industry to share their views with that person about the pending regulation. Well, certainly when we're in the rulemaking process, there are opportunities for affected parties to make their views known. And we want to use those formal processes, and we maybe wouldn't want to augment them with a fancy dinner.
Right.
Whereas sometimes you have an employee whose role is to act as a liaison to maintain relationships with interested parties or stakeholders of your agency. And this is an opportunity to strengthen those relationships and maybe, sort of share information from the agency and kind of understand trends where there isn't a pending matter that's sort of imminent. And that may agitate in the other direction to suggest that that's, there's not a direct sensitivity. There's not an immediate matter pending.
So number 5, I think we sort of touched on, is the identity of other expected participants, so that we get a sensibility about like who else is in the room and who else is likely going to try. Who are we going to be talking to? Number 6 is whether acceptance would create the appearance of preferential treatment to the donor. And I think this is part of what we've been talking about. Like if you have facts that would indicate that someone who is similarly situated would view your employee's participation as providing some sort of preferential access or some sort of preferential treatment to to another interested party. That's
And it's something I would just sort of note here when you're making these determinations and when you're talking to leaders and program personnel in your agency about this part of the determination. Sometimes we have a tendency to view those people who agree with our current thinking as sort of differently than people who disagree with us. And we say, well, they agree with us, so of course we can go hear from them.
Right, exactly.
Right? And that's a kind of viewpoint bias that we want to avoid. So if we don't want to create the habit where those people whose apparent policy preferences align with the administration of the agency are given sort of unquestioning access, and those who disagree are not. That's just as bad as the alternative, where those people who disagree with us are provided access, and those people who agree with us, because we really want to maintain the fairness of our processes, right? That's really what this is about, is maintaining the integrity and impartiality of the government's decision making.
And it's interesting because that kind of gets into a little bit what we have at 7, which is if the government is providing people with views or interests that differ from the donor with access to the government.
Right.
So it's kind of, again, sort of like the balancing, like,
we don't want a situation where we only hear from people who buy us dinner.
Right.
That's not a good thing.
Right.
So if there are a plurality of ways to receive this information, and then people are being provided lots of opportunity, that can be helpful in making this determination.
And then finally, we come back to this piece that is also in the impartiality integrity analysis that the employee does, which is, what is the market value of the gift of free attendance? Now, we obviously need to know that, specifically, we need to know that if we're dealing with a non-sponsor, which we're going to talk about that in a second here. But I do want to take a minute, Patrick, to talk a little bit about this whole notion of the relative importance of the value of the gift to the overall determination of agency interest, or the balancing determination. And this ties into another question that we'd gotten yesterday afternoon, which had to do with, does the nature of sort of like the value that the employee derives from the event material to the dollar value? And the example that they gave was, what if the dinner is just a straight up dinner that's going to be like $500 a pop? So you're getting a $500 dinner, as opposed to going to some sort of a fundraising event where, the cost of attendance is $500, but a goodly portion of that is being siphoned off for a charitable donation.
Yeah, I guess. No, I think that the value, I think, is listed last here for a good reason, because in a sort of an objective sense, there aside from when we're talking about gifts from non-sponsors, there are $20 gifts that, with the right set of circumstances, can be absolutely problematic under the widely attended gathering exception. And there are gifts that are probably worth thousands of dollars, which, given the right set of circumstances, is not problematic at all. I'm thinking about a circumstance when you have a pending matter before an agency, an agency player invites someone to a $20 lunch to make sure that they hear the industry participants' views on something. Well, yes, so what? It's only $20. The opportunity that they're getting for their $20 appears to be, aimed at distorting the decision-making process, and that there's no way. Definitely would never get there. Whereas if someone's waiving a conference fee for a 5-day event, and the conference, a $5,000 conference, but really everyone under the sun's going to be there, the employee's going to have a choice of places to go. Maybe they're speaking on a day, delivering information on behalf of the agency. certainly you could get there. So I think the value is important, but only as one sort of subordinate indicia of the distorting effect that their attendance might have on the government's work.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think that what you have to look at is, is this, you have to look at the totality of the circumstances. Like, is this an event where clearly the agency has a bona fide interest in this employee's attendance, that we think the likelihood that, there's any sort of appearance that the employee is going to be inappropriately, or the agency is going to be inappropriately affected by virtue of the person's attendance at the event. That the dollar value, while not completely immaterial, is certainly secondary or tertiary to the larger picture of, is this an appropriate event? I mean, is the event in and of itself an appropriate event? Is it something that we feel comfortable having our employee attend?
I think sometimes we get into the minutia of this determination and we forget to kind of zoom out.
Right.
And really the purpose of the exception is to allow agencies to have employees attend events where the agency needs them to attend and it's in the agency's interest. And things that agitate against the agency's interest are you going to be criticized? Are other industry participants or other stakeholders going to feel that they're being treated unfairly if this person attends? So you should look at all of those sort of external potential consequences when making this decision. And we give you some specific things to think about to help you with that process. But I don't think we mean to supplant your ability to think strategically about the advisability of attendance.
Yes, and to sort of like now to sort of move to a more pedantic discussion of market value of the gift. An attendant question was, when someone is invited to an event like a dinner or to something where there are tickets that are being, and particularly this occurs with fundraising events in particular, it seems to be, where there is a ticket for admission to the event and the ticket states a certain cost, but clearly that cost isn't what the value of the meal or whatever it is that the employee is actually going to be benefiting from. Whether or not you can back that out, back the contribution or whatever out of the price of admission to get in and use that as the market value. Well, we have a definition of market value, and when it comes to ticketed events, the market value is the ticket that's put, that's printed on the face of the ticket. So if the ticket says $500, then that's the market value of the ticket. And I don't care if you're getting $50 worth of nasty chicken or whatever. The value to you, the market value to you, the employee, of admission to that event is $500 because it cost someone $500 to hand you that ticket and get your seat at the table.
Right.
So that's just, there's no question about that. That's the market value, and we're not getting into games of trying to assess, the actual value of the meal that's being consumed.
All right.
Okay. Before we move on to the sponsor of the event, I know that people have been able to sort of call in with questions if they have them as we're going, but I'd like to pause just a minute so that if anyone has any questions about anything we've discussed so far, I want us to just pause a minute and give people a chance to ask.
There are no questions at this time, but again, as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, press star followed by the number 1. Please stand by for incoming questions.
Okay. Okay.
Our first question comes from Donna. Go ahead, your line is open.
Okay, great.
Excellent. Welcome, Donna.
Hi. My question is about the valuation of a free event, especially something like training. My recollection from looking at the material was that, if you purchase the item, how much would it cost? So then when you look at a training and you say, well, trainings can have widely varied prices. So I'm always, when that comes up, and then I also have a question about how do you value that for the agency? Because I go, well, if the agency wants you to go to a training, they can send you. Did that make sense? That wasn't very clear.
Sure. Well, I think so. Your first question is, how do we determine what the market value of a training presentation is?
Correct.
And then the second question is, how do we determine the agency's interest in sending an employee to a training event?
Correct.
Okay. I think we could take those together. So starting, I think, with your first question, how do we determine the market value? If there's an advertised price, I think you'd want to use the advertised price of the training as the value. If there's not an advertised value, you could look at sort of similar opportunities or look at the cost being borne by other attendees. But this might be another case where we may want to think about another authority before jumping directly to WAG.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter of whether or not there's, a fee charged to anybody in attendance. If this is free to everyone, then that's I think it's a matter of deciding what it is they're receiving. So sometimes when you're offered free training and there's no charge to anybody, you're still getting things of value. You're getting materials. You're getting, oftentimes they have you get food. So it might be a matter of disaggregating the training and what the individual's actually receiving, what are the things of value that the person's receiving. And I know the training in and of itself is not without value. That's always kind of a tricky one, when they're not charging a fee to anybody.
Excuse me, can I interrupt just quickly? What you just said is my issue. The training itself generally has value, especially if they're going to offer credit for something, maybe take CLEs, for example.
Right.
So that is actually the heart of my question. You just crystallized it for me. Do you consider the fact that training itself has value?
Yeah, and I think another question that I'd be interested in is this something the agency wants to send the employee, and do they have a mechanism for sending the employee in their official capacity, rather than using the widely attended gathering exception? It may be possible to use agency gift acceptance authority or the Government Employee Training Act to accept attendance at the event.
Yeah, because I without knowing the totality of the circumstances with it, I mean, it's kind of hard to answer that in the abstract, because it seems to me that I would want to know who's sponsoring the training, is everybody being comped, what's the nature of the training, is it something that they always offer for free? Are they only offering it? I think we would. It's hard to answer that just kind of in a blanket kind of way. Because I think that it's going to depend on, again, what is it that the employee is actually receiving, and who all's receiving it, and is everybody being comped it, or is only some people being comped it, because we run up against this a lot in the context of I know that a lot of our IT folks are routinely being offered opportunities to attend these 1 day or 2 day sort of trainings. And that it's supposedly free to all government employees. Well, the fact of the matter is, it's not free to all government employees, because these are IT types of training, so they're being targeted to IT personnel. So and oftentimes it's only the government folks who aren't being charged, and other folks in attendance are being charged. And so we kind of use that as the baseline for what the value of the training is. And usually they're being offered something other than just the training too. They're being offered food, they're being offered materials, which also you go into the calculus of what the value is.
Right. And I think we don't really need to get to Subpart B on a lot of these, unless the employee sort of intends to attend the training in their personal capacity, or we're thinking about granting them administrative leave to attend. And if this is something where we're trying to contemplate whether they should be attending in their official capacity, we have management considerations there as well that are available to us. So I think these determinations get sort of complicated, and starting in the context of the widely attended gathering exception, that's probably the last place you want to go.
Yeah, and because the other thing too is because I had this question come up just recently from a department where the folks were going to a training event, and they were going to get a discount. It wasn't free, but they were going to get a discount. But the question, we got into the question of who was sponsoring the training, and because it was clearly training, we said if it's a 501c3 organization, you can always look to the Government Training Act, which is 5 USC 4111. So anytime people are being offered training from a 501, free training from a 501c3, 5 USC 4111 is clearly an authority that contemplates agencies allowing their employees to attend those and the employee is accepting free attendance. So again, as Patrick said, I think that there are other authorities to explore in addition to sort of like trying to get a better handle on the circumstances, your particular training circumstances.
Right. So that's a great question. Thank you.
I show no more questions at this time, but again, as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, press star followed by the number 1.
Okay.
Good.
I think we're good. I think we're going to move on to the next part of our WAG worksheet, which this is getting to sort of drilling down into who is the sponsor of the event and who's paying for our employee to attend.
Right.
So the first thing that the question that we have here is who is the sponsor of the event, and it's trying to ascertain like who is largely responsible for this event.
Right.
And OGE issued a legal advisory very recently. It's LA 1704, where we finally put in writing
what sponsor means.
What sponsor means, although we have informally had this as our understanding of what sponsor means for years, but we've finally reduced it to writing. And we've included those criteria at 3.1. So what we're looking for, what you should be looking for as indicia of sponsorship, like what is a bona fide sponsor for purposes of the widely attended gathering is, is the entity responsible for organizing, planning, or conducting the event?
Right.
Are they going to be doing the agenda? Are they identifying the audience, the speakers, the date? Are they serving as the point of contact for the event? Are they merely providing financial support to the event?
Right. So sponsor, organizer, host.
Host is probably one of the best sort of like
some combination of those things, but merely underwriting, merely providing financial support does not make you a sponsor.
Right. Right.
Intuitively.
Exactly. Exactly. So in our case, with our example, Advocacy Now is the person who sent the invitation. And what do you think about them as the sponsor of the event, Patrick?
So they say they're sponsoring a dinner, but that could mean that they are merely providing financial support for the dinner. So we might want to ask that question: Is Advocacy Now really organizing this thing? Are they the organizer? They've figured out who's going to attend. They figure out who gets how many invitations, sort of the flow of the show, all that kind of stuff. Or are they someone who just bought a table? Right. At an event being organized by some other organization. Because when you buy a table, the organization who's organizing the event will call you a sponsor. Right. And then you get to write that on the invitation and confuse ethics officials everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to go back and we have to clarify for ourselves that they are in fact the sponsor of the event. There's every indication that they appear to be, and clearly they are the point of contact for the RSVP, and they've sent out the invitations, and they say that they're sponsoring, and they're not showing who. I mean, they're not. There's no other indication that there's somebody,
someone else.
That's someone else. But the only other thing, though, I think that, and like I said before, I think this is the hard thing to get to, because it goes to question 3.2, which is the cost of the employee's attendance being provided by the sponsor of the event? And this gets to be a tricky question, I think, in circumstances where you have an organization that is doing all of the legwork, but they may very well only be, and I hate to use this word because it taints sort of like it indicates nefariousness, but are like the front for, like the people behind the curtain who are really the ones who are driving the bus, who are really indicating who should come and who are really driving the agenda and who are really saying, and I don't know any handy way around that, but I do think that it is something that we do see sometimes where, in an effort to get around some of the restrictions, including the pledge and stuff, particularly if you've got,
right. Yes, sometimes an organization will have sort of an attached 501c3 organization that pretty much just throws parties. And they don't actually have a funding stream except for the organization they're associated with. So sometimes that complicates this question of who's actually paying for the employees' attendance. But I think you just have to look. You have to kind of figure out how it works.
Yeah, and it might be worth a phone call to the organizing, the person who extended the invitation to find out, is advocacy now the one who's bearing the cost of my employees' attendance, or is someone else bearing the cost of my employees' attendance? So that for certain that, even though the invitation appears to be coming from advocacy now, are they really the person who's extending the invitation to the employee and bearing the cost of the employee's attendance? So those kind of things, I think, kind of have to be done sort of hand in hand, making sure that exactly who's responsible for getting your employee through that door.
Right.
Because that's what we want to know. We want to know who's the gift from.
Right. And I think sometimes we forget as we go through this process that all of these facts, all of this stuff that you learn about the event can go into your prudential decision making.
Yes, absolutely.
So if you find out that this 501c3 basically receives donations from one company, and they basically hold events to share the particularized interests of that company to others, you can take those facts into consideration when determining if it's in your agency's interest to send someone to the event.
Right.
And whether you'll be criticized for attending that event, and whether it might adversely affect the impartiality or integrity of your processes. You don't have to pretend just because there's some legal distinction there that you don't know. So you can sort of weigh all these factors during the process where you determine agency interest.
So on the face of it, it looks as though advocacy now is the sponsor of the event, and we could make the presumption that they are also bearing the cost of our employees' attendance, and if so, then the cost of the employees' attendance is clearly coming from the sponsor of the event.
Right.
Okay, so let's argue for the sake of getting through the rest of this the rest of the form. Let's say that advocacy now says, well, we send out the invitation, but actually it's XYZ organization that has specifically asked us to invite you, and they're bearing the cost of your attendance, and they're not the sponsor of the event.
Okay.
So now that's when we get into the question of, are 100 more persons expected to attend the event, and will the market value of the gift of free attendance be $390 or less? So clearly, once we start getting into it's a non-sponsor, then you're going to have to really drill down into and get hard numbers for your determination, because the regulation is very clear about that there have to be more than 100 persons, and it has to be $390 or less.
That's right. So in this case, we probably wouldn't meet the 100 threshold.
I would suspect not, unless maybe their concept of small is
a different concept of small numbers.
Is entirely different from ours. So in this instance, if it is from the non-sponsor, then it doesn't appear as though they probably would be able to. You would probably not be able to get to yes on those non-sponsor questions. So then the final piece that you have to do, and this is all part of your written determination too. So all of these things are supposed to be included in your written determination, is whether or not a spouse or guest is being offered free attendance. And clearly we only care about this if the employee's attendance is going to be permitted, because if the employee can't go, you're not going to permit the spouse to go absent the employee. So that's why this is the final final piece.
The spouse doesn't have to ask you unless he or she also works at the agency.
That's right. So so the first question under this one, 4.1, is, has the gift of free attendance been extended to the employee's spouse or a guest? Now, this again, I think we mentioned this on Tuesday, and I've had this happen where sometimes it isn't clear. Like even in our invitation, it is not clear that the invitation is to Jamie and a guest. The invitation is to Jamie.
Right, with a reference to his or her colleagues.
So, so you can either go under the assumption that if it's not mentioned about a guest, that means there is no guest. But I would suggest that if your employee wants to know or would like to find out, that they not be the one to call and inquire about that. We talked about this on Tuesday because we think that would be sort of tantamount to a solicitation of an invitation.
Right.
So if you, the ethics official, want to go back and ask whether or not other people will be accompanied by guests and whether or not the invitation includes or anticipates including a spouse or guest, you can certainly do that tactfully without it being tantamount to a solicitation.
Right.
At 4.2, the next question then is the invitation from the same person who invited the employee? Because this is imperative. It has to be from the same person who invited the employee. There can't be a different person inviting the employee's spouse.
Okay.
Will others in attendance generally be accompanied by a spouse or guest? Again, is this being uniquely offered to your employee, or are others also going to have their spouse and guest in attendance? Who's providing the cost of the employee's attendance? And again, this is going to, if it's the same person that the employee that's doing the employee, you will have already done this analysis for the employee. You will have determined if it was a sponsor or a non-sponsor. And then the only thing I want to remind folks with respect to 4.5 is if it's a non-sponsor and we're up against that 100-person and $390 threshold, the $390 threshold is going to have to include both the cost of the employees and the guests' attendance. So you have to aggregate both.
So in this case, we might be getting close, actually.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, that's something we'd have to think about.
So in our case, we don't know the answer to these questions, but that would be the analysis that you would undertake if this were a live question, and this would be information that you would have to find out in order to be able to know whether you could approve the employee's spouse or guest to attend with them.
Okay.
So we've walked through the WAG worksheet, and if anyone has any questions about that or anything else we've discussed today, we'd be happy to answer any questions. We're going to open the phones for anybody. And likewise, if folks who aren't on the phone but are on the Hangout, if you have questions and want to send them to trainingregistration@oge.gov, we're happy to respond to the questions that you have from today's session.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Again, if you'd like to ask a question over the phone, press star followed by the number 1. Unmute your phone and record your name clearly. Please stand by for incoming questions.
I think it's very helpful to go through this in the new framework since the updates to Subpart B. I think we should all feel more comfortable that not a lot has changed. But
exactly.
What we have tried to do is create a greater emphasis on the prudence of accepting all gifts, and provide another opportunity to think about that in the context of invitations.
And I think we have tried also to incorporate into the language of the regulations some things that previously had only resided in legal advisory,
right.
So that things that we have been relying on either through oral advice or through just legal advisories, we tried to take some of that language and incorporate it into the regulations.
Hopefully, eventually it becomes a little more convenient to use the new rule.
Exactly.
Do we have any questions, Holly?
And there are no questions at this time.
Okay.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Cheryl. That was
thank
really
you,
good. and thank you to everyone who joined us. We hope you found this to be helpful. Again, this recording as well as part 1 will be available on the YouTube channel as soon as we're done here.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to go back and refer to it, do this experience again, share it with colleagues. This and all our other courses are available, and we do hope you find them useful and are able to use them. And as always, if you have ideas for training that you feel like we haven't offered recently or haven't done at all, right. We always like to hear your ideas because it saves us having to come up with our own.
That's right.
So, if you have suggestions, we do like to hear those, and we do our best to act upon them. And we hope you will join us again soon for another presentation.
Very good. Thanks very much, everyone.